Good afternoon and welcome to our post SBC 23 roundtable. It may be less than a roundtable from the RSVPs I've been getting this morning. Guys not being able to make it when you've got pastors involved. That's often the case, but that's okay. We do have an executive director online with us, Randy Adams, and he'll be joining us here in just a moment as we get started. I've titled this today, Raise the Alarm, SBC Leaders Sound Off on Crisis. Because there have been so many things that have really been surfacing in the last few years that have become somewhat of a crisis point. And we've seen a number of things that have kind of resurfaced multiple times over the last couple of years. So we're going to address those and look at some of those. We want to look at a number of at least a few of the resolutions and some of the motions that we saw at the SBC 23 and get some general impressions of how that is going to impact the local church right where you serve. So if you're serving in a local church, these are things that may potentially impact you. Well, let's go ahead and jump right into it. I'd like to bring in Randy Adams. He is the executive director for the Northwest Baptist Convention, and we're glad to have you joining us, Randy.
Thank you, Bobby. Glad to be here.
Well, you and I have done several interviews before, particularly a couple of years ago when you were running for the SBC presidency, and we're going to talk about that race a little bit again here in a minute. I know that you probably have had several people come at you wanting you to run again, but that probably is not in the cards for you now, huh?
No, I don't believe so. I am grateful for the experience the first time, and I think the whole issue of transparency and accountability, which were the top two issues that I talked about, as well as expanding participation through remote access voting, but especially the transparency and accountability. I think that we were on point 2 years ago to highlight that, because those are terms you hear all the time now, and rightly so, because I think we still have this sense that we lack transparency in a number of ways.
Yeah, I agree. Well, look, let's jump right into SBC 23. There's way more there than we'll have time to discuss within the hour. But I want to start off by just asking you, just from your general impressions, what alarms you the most right now about cooperating in the SBC?
I think I've tried to think about it from a procedural and a long-term standpoint. It seems to me that we have become much more top-down in the SBC in recent years. Top-down both in terms of strategy with the North American Mission Board. We don't cooperate at the local level like we once did. Decision makers are people who are remote from our field, who don't know the towns and communities and neighborhoods where our churches serve. Even at the state level, we understand we don't know all the details about the various communities in our conventions. So we work with local leaders, local pastors, local churches who know the leaders in their community, who know the neighborhoods in their town. And I think we've really stepped away from that. It's one reason that our mission impact has diminished greatly in the last 15 years. The other thing, I think we've become top down in terms of our application of theology and Bible, the Baptist faith and message. It once was we trusted local churches. If they wanted to be a part of the mission effort of Southern Baptists, they affiliated, and usually often just by giving money. Not that that was the best way to do it, but that was typically. And then if there was an issue in the local church, it was generally surfaced at the associational level. And associations handled theological issues and biblical issues in local churches. Almost never at the state convention was that done, and certainly not at the SBC level. Well, now at the SBC level, we have a credentials committee and then the executive committee attempting to police 47,000 churches throughout 50 states.
And that's a good way to say it. Police. Yeah, police.
I think it really is. And I've had multiple conversations with the Credentials Committee in the last few months regarding the church. And it's just been remarkable because they don't have investigative powers or authority, and yet they're trying to make recommendations about all these I don't even know how many churches have been referred to them for various issues, but they don't have the ability to investigate. They talk to people who they hope might know more than they do, about. And then they try to bring a recommendation to the executive committee and ultimately to the SBC. Well, we didn't used to do it that way. And I just think this top-down policing establishing a committee to police 47,000 churches from the SBC level. I don't know where this is going to go, but it seems to me it's not going in a good direction. I don't know how you do it. And the committee, well, I won't get into the particulars of the committee makeup, but some of the people on the committee, they just didn't have the background. Great people, but not necessarily the background to address some of the issues they were trying to deal with.
Yeah, no question. And just for a little bit of clarity, people who have not been deeply engaged in the convention for a long time don't realize that every year for many, many years, the Credentials Committee has gotten questions, gotten concerns about churches outside of the doctrinal lines or whatever. And every year they deal with these things. Just this year, it was really raised to a new level because of the issue with Saddleback being such a large mega church. And, many of the post-convention news reports, they said very little other than, the SBC kicked out Saddleback, and even the way they communicate that sometimes is not accurate as to Southern Baptist polity, but it's because we're just not a denomination like they're familiar with, at least in that point. Well, Randy, what motions really stood out to you as a local leader? You're actively involved in your local church there in Washington State. I know your wife is also actively involved there in your local church, so you're very active there. If I remember right, it's a church plant of only a couple of years, isn't it?
Correct. We're about 5 years old now, and church is doing really, really well. But yeah, we're involved in that church.
Okay, so you're involved in your local congregation. You and your wife both very active there, and then of course you're a state convention leader as the executive director of Northwest, covering 2.5 states in the northwest of our country. So you kind of can look at this from multiple perspectives. So what motions stood out during SBC 23 that really kind of got your attention?
Well, one is there were motions regarding transparency. And we last year there was a motion requesting a forensic audit of the North American Mission Board, and that was ruled out of order. This year, at least 2 motions that requested Form 990 type transparency from our entities were referred to the executive committee. So that certainly were some motions that caught my attention, because it's interesting. If you're a not-for-profit, other than a church, you have to fill out a Form 990 form, which requires a lot of specifics about the entity financially. Our entities don't have to do that because they're treated as a church, it would be. The contention of many of us, however, is that even though we don't have to reveal or report to the IRS, we should report to Southern Baptists, to the donors, those that support us as conventions and entities. We should report to them the financial information that they request. And so anyway, that was encouraging, I think, and we'll see where that goes with the Form 990. One of the interesting motions, I think, that was made that I also wonder why it was handled the way it was and what this means moving forward, and that is to amend the Baptist Faith and Message. So to add...
that's a huge deal. To make a change in a governing document. That's a big deal.
I think that's a really big deal. And just take a motion a second and a quick vote, basically, to amend the Baptist Faith and Message. I don't believe that's ever happened before. Any amendments we've had before, we've established a committee that went through a deliberative process, had theologians, pastors, lay people, a balanced committee to bring a thoughtful recommendation to the convention, like the Baptist Faith and Message 2000. So to amend our statement of faith in the way in which it was from the floor of the convention, I think that sets a precedent. It does something I think we may well regret, because every entity and many of our state conventions require adherence to the Baptist Faith and Message. In order to be employed at the Northwest Convention, you have to do that. In order to affiliate as a church with our convention, you have to ascribe to the Baptist Faith and Message 2000. Except now, it's the Baptist Faith and Message 2000 plus the recent amendment in 2023. And if we do this every year or two or three, that's going to get really confusing. Our missionaries on the field, for example, they had to sign a statement or make some declaration that they would adhere to the Baptist Faith and Message 2000. And that's fine. But if we do this every year or two or three, what's that going to mean for missionaries and seminary professors and whatnot that don't know year to year what the Baptist Faith and Message is actually going to say? So I think that's a concerning thing personally.
Yeah,
Just
absolutely.
procedurally, process wise.
Yeah, well, and a lot of times process is what really kind of gets you to fumble sometimes,
Right.
without any doubt. And people don't understand the process sometimes. Just a quick note, Randy, I don't know if you realize it, but your camera is shaking a little bit.
Okay.
I don't know if it's your desk moving or something, but it's bouncing a little bit.
Okay.
You alluded to this, and we're going to come back to several things you just hit on. But when you were running as a candidate for SBC president, you talked about raising the issue of transparency and financial transparency. And we've seen that come back to the floor as a theme. Last year, I know after Anaheim, my one big takeaway was the messengers want transparency, but it kept being pushed aside procedurally. Again, this year it's been brought, as you mentioned, in two different motions that were brought, and we're going to see how that ultimately is handled. But for you, how frustrating has it been to not get the financial transparency that the messengers have obviously been requesting?
Well, personally, I think it's ridiculous. I think, for an entity to receive cooperative program dollars and sometimes mission offering dollars from our churches, and then to refuse sometimes to report that which is required. For example, if a Baptist member of one of our churches requests a copy of the salary schedules, they're required to provide that, and yet they've refused to do so in a number of cases, which is just in direct violation of the Baptist Faith and Message. And I guess, or of the business and financial plan. I guess at this point, if their trustees don't require them to follow the governing documents of the SBC, they think they can get away with not doing so, which is where we've been. I think it's very frustrating. For example, Chuck Kelly, who wrote a book examining the Great Commission resurgence and how it really resulted in a Great Commission decline, huge decline. I would really encourage everybody to read that book. One of the things he revealed is that he tried to find out how many church plants does North American Mission Board actually fund? Because last year it was reported that we had 639 new church starts. What a lot of Baptists don't realize is many of those new church starts are not funded by NAM. In the Northwest, half of our church starts, we had 23 last year, about half are not funded by the North American Mission Board. But NAM does not report how many they actually fund. So Chuck Kelly, when he did his book, he asked them, and he made multiple efforts to find out how many church plants are you actually funding. And he said that they adamantly refused to tell him. Now that to me is shocking. So you have a retired seminary president, a Southern Baptist leader we've known and respected for decades and decades, and the North American Mission Board won't tell him how many church plants they actually fund. And they said they know the number. They're just not going to reveal the number. So of those 639, they did say in the Book of Reports that they only assessed 374 potential church planters last year. 374. I think it was 73%, 70 something. I think 73% were approved. So at most they funded, it was under 300 last year, but they spent $80 million cooperative program dollars in church planting. So
well, and that's trying to put together the numbers, and it's a shame we're having to try to figure this out in our heads, because that ought to be information we have. But just because that 70-something% went through assessment and completed it, you and I both know, even though a guy and his spouse go through the assessment, sometimes they don't end up planting, and
correct.
sometimes they don't end up planting immediately. So
Correct.
it may be several years down the road before they actually plant, if they ever plant. So, I mean, we're trying to string together numbers here that I mean, we're just making stuff up as we go almost because they won't give enough solid information. And let me just say this real fast too. The book you're talking about by Kelly, Dr. Kelly, we'll put a link to that down here in the description here in a minute, because that is a good book. It's called The Best Intentions.
Right.
And he does go through all of that. And you referenced that, a quote from the book. He tried to document what's happened since the Great Commission resurgence passed, and he's tried to document that. I think every Southern Baptist ought to get a hold of it and read it without any question at all. Let me ask you this. Did you feel like the messengers had ample opportunity to ask questions of the entity leaders during the meeting?
No. I think at most 2 questions were asked, the ones that I heard, and then time ran out. So now there were some good questions asked, I thought, but very little opportunity to ask questions. Another thing I noticed this year that was odd is people would make motions and then call for the question after they made the motion.
Immediately.
Immediately. And so to try to cut off debate for whatever reason. And it was almost like you're weaponizing the call to question, calling for the question to so that people can't debate or can't give a contrary viewpoint on a particular motion. So I didn't think that was helpful at all, cutting off debate in the way it was many times.
Well, in the last few years, we've seen several things that were kind of pushed aside or something using that technique. It just seemed like this year, you're right. I noticed that several of the business sessions, there was like no time at all. And this is the business meeting. This is the only time all the messengers get together. 2 days basically out of the year. And nothing against the worship in any of our conventions. There's usually great music, great worship time, a lot of those kind of things that are great for connecting people, not only to God, but we get to connect to each other as well when we're at the convention. But I think without a question that there needs to be substantially more time designated to be able to let the messengers have conversation about what's happening, either the motions, the resolutions, whatever it is, and have ample debate. And I heard somebody say earlier that they felt like there was a weaponization of parliamentary procedure. What would be your perception of that?
I think so. In fact, I've used the same term, a weaponization of ending debate in particular. One thing to think about too, I think, from kind of a broad perspective, the big issue right now, as I see it in Southern Baptist life, is a loss of trust. And when you lose trust, it's one thing when you're growing and things are going well and baptisms are up and church plants are up and everything, then people basically say, well, it must be working. But when you're in steep decline and every Great Commission metric is down, finances are down. I know in Baptist Press, they've been touting since the first of the year that we're above budget in cooperative program giving. What they haven't been reporting, however, is that we're under last year. I think through May, about 5.5% under cooperative program giving last year. Well, that to me, it could reflect economy. It could reflect declining trust. In some sense, in some ways it does. We know for a fact for some churches, there's been a loss of trust. Well, when you have a loss of trust, you have to go above and beyond to rebuild trust. And and transparency does that. You have to hold yourself accountable. You have to be transparent. You have to provide more information than people are asking for as a demonstration that you have nothing to hide. And so when entities are not forthcoming, or when any individual is not forthcoming with information that helps build trust, then there's going to be a response to that. And the response is often seen in declined giving, declined participation. And I think that's what we're seeing in the SBC. It's a challenging time to be a leader. Whenever you're leading something that's declining, that's very challenging. And one thing a leader has to do in times like that is be forthcoming with information, hide nothing, tell everything, reveal the money, reveal the performance, and try to answer the question why. Why are we planting fewer churches? Why are we baptizing fewer people? Why is our net increase in churches declining? Last year we lost over 400 churches net. Well, there's a reason for that, I think, and that should be
Yeah.
explored. It should be acknowledged and discussed openly or honestly.
Yeah.
And so when information is hidden from anybody, and from
Yeah.
Southern, it's just not helpful, because as we know, Southern Baptists can vote by raising a ballot. They can vote by writing a check or not writing a check. And I think we're seeing that. In fact, we know we're
Yeah.
seeing that.
Yeah,
Cooperative
absolutely.
program, and leaders don't talk about, but cooperative program is down from our peak somewhere around $80 million.
Mm.
And if you look at that 80 million and factor inflation into it, it's probably closer to $200 million. I just think we need to be honest about these things. Our church, our missionary count is down over 2,000 missionaries on the foreign field from where we were 13 years ago or 14 years ago.
Right.
Same way with North American missionaries in terms of
Yeah.
church planters, way, way, way down. Well, you just got to tell the truth and be honest about things, whether they be good or bad, so that and try to define reality so that you can make better decisions and hopefully start doing better in years to come, reaching
Right.
more people, starting more churches.
Well, and putting a positive spin on something, I'm okay with that, in the sense of,
Sure.
trying to be challenging, casting vision. Let's make a big difference. We can do this, but you have to be honest and realistic. But what I heard out of this convention was, I heard a lot of positive sales marketing kind of lines. And I don't even remember who this quote was from. You may remember, but whoever said one time, some time ago, tell the people, trust the people.
Right.
And you've got to be honest. So the report from the executive committee is, we're running ahead of budget. We're
Right.
ahead of where our goal is. Well, okay, that's fine and good until you stop and say, but you keep lowering the goal every year, because the
Correct.
income keeps going down, the numbers keep going down. And so this last year, you lowered the goal again. The year before, you lowered the goal again. So now you've lowered the goal and you're anticipating a certain loss. And so we're running ahead of that goal that you've lowered. So if you line up the numbers side by side, year by year, and you set up a trend line, just set it out on a spreadsheet,
Mm-hmm.
you can look and see the line, just all the lines, not just that, but all
Right.
of the metrics are going downhill, without a doubt. Hey, look, Randy, let me read something to you. This came from one of the guys who's a pastor west of Atlanta, who is going to be on here today. And he was diagnosed with a COVID just this morning. He'd been having a headache and he got tested, and he couldn't do it. But he sent me a fairly clear analysis of his feeling of what happened at the SBC. He and some members from his church were there in New Orleans. And I want to just kind of get your feeling about this. He hits on some of the things you've mentioned, but a few others too. He says, I can tell you, I remain very leery of the SBC upon returning from New Orleans. And I should have said, I mentioned where he was from. This is Keith Stell, pastor at New Georgia Baptist Church in Villa Rica. He said the James Merritt motion that passed is a lump of leaven to further dilute and distract the SBC from faithful dependence on the truth of God's word and further shift of clarity of our Baptist Faith and Message 2000. I would sum up the lingering effect of the real divide that is apparent in the SBC. It is not a matter of our church discerning whether we leave the SBC, but rather discerning how the SBC has left us. Lack of financial transparency, of which I contacted Mike Ebert of NAM. Mike Ebert is the public relations vice president.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, and the convention sermon was not only poor exegesis, but was filled with vitriol and attack. I told our messengers in mid-sermon he had gone off the rails and to guard themselves. What would be your response to that local church pastor's assessment of what he saw at SBC 23?
Well, I would concur with much of what he experienced. I listened to the annual sermon. I thought he started great with his own personal testimony and what Baptists had done to reach him and reach his wife. Powerful. But basically, he said anyone who is a critic or asking questions about the direction of the SBC or particulars about the SBC is not concerned about the mission. And maybe they're not even people of prayer. Maybe they post more than they pray. And he said, you just got to get on with the mission and not be essentially critical of the entities or the direction of the SBC. What I would say is many of us who have had grave concern about the SBC, the reason we've had grave concern is because of the decline of the mission. That's really been my focus more so than any other thing is I just grieve the fact that we're baptizing half as many people as we did 15 years ago. We're starting less than half as many churches right now. Our giving has gone down. Like I said, probably $200 million when you factor in inflation. Our missionary count has dropped from 5,600 to 3,500 for international missionaries. So a lot of those of us who have great concern about the direction of the SBC, our concern is focused on the mission itself and our decline in effectiveness regarding the mission. So, transparency to me is a no-brainer. I mean, that's just something I can't imagine when I was a pastor refusing to answer questions regarding transparency and how we spend our money. I can't imagine that at the Northwest Baptist Convention. I mean, I tell our folks, and I remind our board, every board meeting, my board meets next week. I always remind them, I work for you. You don't work for me. Your job is not first to be our spokesman and supporters out there among the churches. Your first job is to hold me accountable. Am I doing what we've agreed to do, and am I doing it well? And if I am, and you judge that I am, then it's wonderful that you can say something good about the convention and support the convention, but that's not your first priority. And I think at the SBC, and the other thing is, I can't imagine not only not telling a board member, but not telling any member of any of our churches. If they want to know something specific about finances or performance, I'd do my best to get them an answer and to get them an answer quickly. Yeah. And, whether that answer is good or bad, or whether they agree with me or not, at least if they know you're being honest with them and you're trying to, do your best to provide good information, they can respect that. I personally, it's hard to respect someone who's hiding the truth from us, whether it's good or bad.
Well, at least if you feel they're hiding the truth, if you have that impression, then no, you're exactly right.
So, and that's partly what that pastor's expressing, the lack of transparency and being berated because you have questions about the effectiveness of the mission of the SBC. We're all about mission. That's what we are. We're a missionary convention. I mean, historically, that's what created us, and it's what fuels and it's really the only thing that keeps us together right now. Because the one thing that we all believe in is sharing the gospel with those who've never heard, both domestically and internationally. Right. And if we didn't think that we can do that better with an IMB out there, or do it better cooperating to start churches, why would we send our money and why would we give our time? The only reason we do that is because we believe in the mission.
Yeah, and that's the debate many churches are having now. Is it right? Are we being good stewards of God's mission money that our people are giving to go through this? And I mean, you just mentioned it. I think that's a good example for an executive director, an associational leader, or any of our entity leaders to be able to stand in front of their board and clarify, this is the role, this is what we should do, and to be transparent. I remember when I was executive director in Michigan, I was speaking at an association that I can't remember, some kind of a meeting or conference, and one of the fellows came in and he was pretty riled. And he was kind of upset they had a state convention person there because he didn't want anything to do with the state convention people. They're high and lofty and all this other stuff. And so before the meeting started, he came up to me and you could tell he was tensed up, and he came up and he looked at me. He said, look, anything you say today, I'm going to pay no attention to, because I'm not going to have somebody who sits high and mighty in a corner office somewhere making tons of money off of my mission dollars. And I'm not going to pay any attention to it because y'all are just getting big and rich up there. And he said, I'd like to know how much you make, because nobody will tell us that. You're probably making hundreds of thousands of dollars off of our mission money. And I looked back at him and I said, I'll tell you exactly what I make. And I gave him a breakdown. Here's what I get in reimbursements as far as travel and expenses. Here's what I get salary and housing. Here's, et cetera. And he looked at me, he goes, are you serious? That's all you make? He was surprised. And I found out later that he happened to be a factory worker in one of the automotive plants, and he was nearing retirement, and he was probably earning somewhere around six figures. And of course, I was nowhere near six figures. So all of a sudden it changed his perspective, but it changed his perspective because I was willing to just be honest. Look, here it is. I don't mind. Here's how much I'm making, and this is how we're spending your money. And he was very attentive throughout the entire training deal that I did that day, which was quite interesting. Well, look, let's keep moving, get sidetracked. One of the motions was what was called the law amendment. Mike Law, who did this. That's right, isn't it, Mike? I believe that's right.
I think that's right.
Yeah, Mike Law is one of the 9 Marks pastors. And so some were very kind of put aside, back and forth about, should we do this? Should we not? But it basically was adding some language, trying to kind of settle the debate, I guess you could say, about who is a pastor, what is a pastor, who can be a pastor, that kind of thing. What was your impression of the law amendment and the necessity of doing that? Yes or no?
My gut instinct on that was that the law amendment essentially is trying to do what the Baptist Faith and Message does. Now, I've been told that the law amendment goes beyond that and is maybe necessary to have that in our Constitution and bylaws. I really question that personally. Mm-hmm. I think, we acted this year on a handful of churches that had female pastors. And in some cases, it wasn't the senior pastor. It was a staff pastor. Saddleback now has a teaching pastor, a female teaching pastor. And based on what the Baptist Faith and Message states, the convention took action. So I'm not really certain why we need in our Constitution an additional amendment or an additional statement regarding who is a pastor. I just don't know. There's probably nuances and things that I haven't thought about or have overlooked, because truthfully, that was not the focus of my thinking going into this convention, because I knew, based on what the Baptist Faith and Message says, that we have the capacity and the ability to define, what church is in good standing with the SBC, what church can remain affiliated with the SBC in terms of, their position on female pastors. And so I just don't know why we need that in the Constitution personally. Others may have a good reason as to why we should, but.
Yeah, I was debating it too, but I think to some extent there are some within the convention that want to orchestrate everybody needs to be just exactly the same. And
right,
Rick Warren, I don't think he did himself any favors. The charges that he made, in the sense of going with this national blast with emails and videos and all that, I don't think that really helped his case very much at all. But one of the things that I think he did make clear, and is true, is typically Southern Baptists have had a good bit of latitude, and not on key critical doctrinal issues, but on tertiary issues a lot of times. And, somebody down the road operates differently than we do. Somebody down the road has one kind of approach to a communion. Another one has a different approach. In some cases, this is a certain approach to worship and the way we think a worship service ought to be structured. And here it's a different, and there just has to be a lot of latitude in some of those things. But the reality is, it seems like to some extent there may be some that are wanting to come in and keep narrowing the tent to say everybody needs to be exactly like what I think we need to be like at that point. And I'm with you. I think the current language is adequate. more than adequate. I think it's sufficient for making the determinations that we need to, and I'm not sure that we need to do anything further than that as far as a constitutional amendment or something. Look, you mentioned a while ago about trustees. Talk to us a minute about the motion that was made for trustee training prior to service. Do you think that would be valuable to have an outside organization to train the trustees of all of our entities and not the entity train its own trustees?
I do. In fact, that was part of my platform 2 years ago when I
Okay.
ran is trustee training. At that time, I was advocating that the executive committee set up a method to train trustees of all entities, because I think that our entities train differently. Some probably do better than others. But it appears at least that a lot of our trustees, they believe that their job is to support the entity on whose board they sit. And I was a trustee for 10 years of a seminary. I was the chairman of that board, as a matter of fact. And it took me, a few years to really figure out what my role was as a trustee. And I think that if there was some form of training that was objective, that wasn't slanted toward, the desires or whatever of the particular entity, I think that would be helpful. And the entity can provide its own training. I don't think there's any problem there. But I do think trustees should certainly be made known. It should be made known to them that they represent the churches of the SBC to the entity, not the entity to the churches. And I'm quite certain not all trustees understand that. They think their job is to support the president, for example, of the entity, or support the entity and represent the entity back to the churches. Well, that's very much a secondary responsibility. The primary responsibility is to represent the churches to the entity.
Yeah. Yeah. I said the other day that I think there ought to be a policy in place. I don't know how you'd enforce it, but a policy in place that our entities are not allowed to give anything of benefit to trustees other than helping them with travel, getting them to their location, et cetera. They can't give them logoed shirts. They can't give them backpacks. They can't give them mugs. They can't give them sound systems, whatever. I don't know what all they're giving away these days. But I've talked to a few trustees that have said, yeah, we love going to these meetings, man. We come away with a lot of good stuff. And it's like, to me, that almost sounds like you're just trying to buy loyalty. If you really want a shirt that says, Southwestern Seminary and you're on their board, go down to the gift shop and spend your $22 or whatever it is to get a shirt, that has the Swivitz logo on it, but I don't see that will ever happen.
Well, if you were one of the 6,500 people that attended the NAM luncheon, free lunch and a free backpack. And we're talking an Osprey backpack.
Oh.
Someone Googled that particular model and said it was $65. I have an Osprey. I have a larger one. It's a great backpack, but that's a lot of money. A $65 backpack multiplied by 6,000 people, or however many thousands it was that they gave out. I don't know. I agree with that person regarding entities. It's really hard. And that's why transparency, again, is so very, very important, because it's really hard for a trustee to stand up in a trustee meeting and have a contrary viewpoint to the president or the majority of the trustees. Some situations are more difficult than others to do that, but that should happen in board meetings, and it should be that they're asking questions because they've been provided really good information. Transparent information regarding finances and performance. And I just don't think that's always true.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Well, let's take another shift. You were a former presidential candidate back in Nashville. What did you think about the battle this year over Bart Barber and Mike Stone? Now, Mike Stone was in the running when you were running in Nashville for president, and he re-ran again this year. Bart Barber had completed 1 year, had a second year. It's kind of customary, but it's not mandated. It's not mandated by our any of our documents. So, and so normally with rare exception, has there been somebody who's challenged the incumbent for that second year as such. So Mike Stone apparently did this year. CBN, got behind him again, which has been an organization that's been kind of building steam or attempting to build steam. But he was pretty overwhelmingly defeated at this point. What are your thoughts about that battle over the presidency?
Well, I was kind of surprised actually that he was defeated as soundly as he was. I think Bart Barber, as you said, there's a tradition that the president served 2 years, 2 terms. In fact, never in the history of the SBC has a sitting president been defeated for his second year. It's never happened. We've had presidents choose not to run. Ed Litton chose not to run, but no one's been defeated. So Mike had an uphill battle. My great concern regarding the president is we need a president who is more than a cheerleader for the SBC and basically cheers on what we do and always presents the best image of who we are and what we do. I really think that we need a president who calls things out in terms of accountability and transparency. And when we aren't, I can't imagine, had I been elected president, one thing I would have done, if an entity leader refused to provide financial information that a messenger was asking for, I would have called him out on that. And I would have made it clear from the president's seat that that's not appropriate, that Southern Baptists deserve to have their questions answered when it comes to finances or performance. And so that's my great concern. I think when you live in a time where trust is as low as it is today, the president has a unique opportunity to help build trust back. And I think the only way he does that, or the best way he does that, is enforce or force or persuade our entities to be more transparent. And I have not seen that from Bart Barber, at least not when it comes to finances. And I wish we would see that.
Yeah.
More.
Yeah. We need that megaphone platform to say we need to see this. Without any question. Well, look, we want to wrap up here in a minute. I want to ask you as we close in just a moment about some of the things that are happening at the North American Mission Board. You've been very vocal about that and tried to continue to build cooperative relationships there and kind of been pushed back. But before we do, I want to ask you a question relative to our kind of convention as a whole. How much of what we're seeing happen today in our convention do you think is generational? Let me clarify. Boomer leadership versus the millennial leadership versus now we're seeing Gen Xers come into seeking power. How do you think that's impacting what we're seeing now?
I really don't know. I don't think about it so much as generational leadership. I do think that as Southern Baptists, we have a demographic problem. I think of that more. So, for example, I think our average age is now 56 for members of SBC churches. We're old, we're aging out, and so sometimes we have a lot of issues that we're facing. We do have the trust issue, as we talked about, but we also have a demographic issue. Right. We're an older people, so we don't have many younger pastors, younger leaders. And younger people in the pews. I think that's a huge issue. That's probably a bigger issue than the age of the leadership itself. I think. I could be wrong about that, but I see that. I think age doesn't matter so much as viewpoint. So back to the transparency viewpoint, whether the guy's 60 or 70 or whether he's 30 or 40, it matters less to me. What matters more, and I think not just to me, but to Southern Baptists, is the character of the leader, the quality of leadership, whether they're forthcoming or not with information. That to me is more important. But right. And I've also, if it's harder to lead pastors if you've not been a pastor and pastors don't respect you. Right. So that makes it harder for, say, a 35-year-old to provide top level leadership because he hasn't done enough yet. You know,
Right.
you've got to have a track record as a pastoral leader, as a shepherd, before other pastors follow you. And I think sometimes we forget that a 35 or 40-year-old guy, you know, he could be an awesome pastor, a great preacher, and have tremendous giftedness, but he also has to have the respect of pastors.
Right.
And you gain the respect of pastors differently, perhaps, than you do your own congregation, because you think a pastor leads the people that he looks in the eye every week and he preaches
Right.
to every week. Denominational leaders are leading people that don't even know them personally.
Right.
They're distant from them, and they
Yeah.
certainly
Very,
see
very
them
few.
every
Yeah.
week.
They become leaders of leaders. Yeah.
They become leaders of leaders, and leaders of leaders, requires something different than
Yeah.
pastoral leadership does. There's some great pastors who wouldn't necessarily be great leaders, convention leaders, for example.
Right. Yeah, I see that. Well, look, let's handle one other question that just came in. Bree and Babes ask, what plans do you have for the SBC 24? What do you see coming in 2024?
Well, I'm hopeful that from the executive committee we'll be getting something positive on this Form 990 request, the financial transparency request. I think if we can keep moving forward on that, that's going to be a very good thing. Beyond that, I haven't thought too much about 2024, actually. I do fear that if we're discussing the issues of particular churches on the floor of the convention next year, like we did this year, if that becomes a regular feature that we're discussing who to seat and who not to seat every year, that's probably not a good thing.
Yeah. Well, in the past, the way that's worked is when churches, and every year churches are disfellowshipped for one thing or another. I mean, it's been
Right.
happening for years, but rarely do they appeal. So
Yes.
you don't have that issue, but there is an appeal process. And so this year, Saddleback, I think, was the first to launch an appeal after that. And once that was known, then several others got on board and launched appeals as well. And so there is an appeal, but I agree with you. If because of that, it was discovered that using the label pastor for females in Southern Baptist churches has become evident in some 1900 churches, I think they said, potentially not necessarily a lead pastor role, but at least supporting ministry role. And just think about it. If this continues to surface and bubble to the top, and then all of a sudden, they go in and they say, okay, we've identified, and there's 250 of these churches that are disfellowshipped and, broad swath in the, February executive committee meeting, well, then by the June annual meeting, half of those could come and want an appeal.
Right.
Well, now you have a real problem to have 6 minutes committed to them stating their case, a 3-minute rebuttal, the voting that has to take place. And now you've got, 40, 50, 60, 80, 100 different churches trying to appeal. And that's all the convention would be. I mean, it literally would be nothing much more than that. So, yeah, I think that really could potentially be a real hazard. Well,
Right.
look, let's wrap up with it. Oh, go ahead, Randy. Go ahead.
Well, I'll say one other thing, and I don't know the answer to this question, is how many of these women who are called pastors are ordained? I suspect that the use of the word pastor has not been restricted to ordained clergy. I think a
Right.
lot of these women are probably not ordained, and yet they're ascribed as a pastor. And
Right.
so anyway, that's a kind of a side note, perhaps, to the use of
No. I agree because, pastoral gifting, that you can't say that's restricted to men only. There are women that have
Sure.
tremendous pastoral gifts when you look at that,
Right.
and have worked very effectively in lots of different roles across the time. And in the past, many churches have just, identified a ministry leader, children's ministry, youth ministry, director, leader, lots of different variations. But I think some of the trend of recent years, many churches now have shifted to say, if you're on staff in the church, you're going to be a pastor of, or whatever. And
Right.
I think you're right there. We probably need to have a better dividing line not just saying the word, but say, has this person been ordained as a pastor in
Right.
that sense, or is this strictly a title kind of a thing?
Right.
It's still hard to understand, and it conveys other things to those on the outside, the
Yeah.
perception of it. Well, look, let's wrap up with this. In looking at the North American Mission Board, you've had lots of conversations and discussion about North American Mission Board. They didn't get but 2 questions this year. One of the responses by Kevin Ezel was rather humorous, already thought out, obviously already planned out exactly what he wanted to say. But the reality was he didn't really get pushed too hard because there just wasn't much time. And again, only 2 questions, and it pretty well ended. Last year's convention, they asked for questions, and his response was, "Well, I'd rather not." And I think he really would rather not. But what questions should have been asked of NAM this year? I mean, if you were able to ask any questions, what would you like to have seen asked that obviously didn't get asked this year?
Well, I think the questions that were asked were good questions. One was on, will you provide the financial information that is required of a Form 990? I think that was a good question.
Yep.
I think his answer was not good. His answer was basically, trust us. We have an internal auditor who reports to our trustees. And basically, that's all you need to know. You don't need to know.
Yeah.
You just need to know we got it handled. I don't think. And so part of the thing is there's not much time to ask questions, and then there's no time for follow up. So sometimes when you ask a question, the entity leader can answer it however he chooses or not answer it. Like in this case, he didn't really answer that question, but then the questioner has no opportunity for follow up. So that would be one thing that would be helpful, I think, the follow up. I think the second question he was asked was regarding Echo Church, from which Andy Wood, the new pastor of Saddleback, came. He was really not truthful with that answer because Echo Church was a hub church for NAM. Their NAM staff person in that area is a member of Echo Church. They did their training there, their assessing there. Echo Church was huge in what they do. Echo Church had a female teaching pastor, Andy's wife, who's now a teaching pastor at Saddleback. That was a key church for them, and he didn't make it seem like it was. Something else that people have forgotten about Echo Church, they have a brewery, Echo Church Brewery. Right. And one of their I say outreach methods, I don't know if outreach is the right word, is a beer and Bible study. And I was kind of surprised that when that was revealed a year and a half ago or so, that it didn't have more traction than it got. Because to me, a church with a brewery and that being a hub church for North American Mission Board, I thought that might create more question and more issue than it really did. But so anyway, I think
I think that's documented on the reformnamnow.org site, isn't it?
I believe it is. I
believe in that documentation. I think I remember. That's where I remember seeing it. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think so. Now the other thing is so for example, I would like to have a question like this. NAM reported last year 639 new church starts. Dr. Ezel, how many of those were actually and are actually being funded by NAM? I think that would be a great question because they don't report that. They don't reveal that. They just reveal the total number of churches started. I also thought it was really curious. I mean, he's 13 years into this role, and he found it necessary to once again go back and say that you cannot trust any of the reporting of his predecessors. And one thing I think it's important for Southern Baptists to know is that I've gone back to 1980, and the lowest years in 45 years almost now of church starting, the lowest probably 6 or 7 years now are the last 6 or 7 years. So in other words, it wasn't just the first decade of the 21st century that he has a question about or quibbles with. What about the numbers from the 1990s or the 1980s? During both of those decades, we started far more churches than we're starting today with far less money. So I would like that to be asked as well. And I would tell you that I think the reason our church plant numbers have fallen so greatly is we used to rely much more on local leadership, the associational directors of missions, state convention staff. NAM worked through state conventions. And state conventions largely worked through associations, and certainly in conjunction with associations. This top-down approach to church planting, in which all of the assessing is done by the North American Mission Board. I mean, here I am in the Northwest. My staff has no say-so in who is approved as a church planter in the Northwest for NAM funding. NAM does that completely on their own. They do all the assessing. They determine who gets funded. I have no say-so. My staff has no say-so. You know, that kind
well, even
of
local associations. I mean,
local associations have no say-so.
In the past, all the partnerships were, working together. When I was associational missionary, I knew exactly how many of my planters were being funded. I knew how much they were being funded. I knew how long that funding was going to go. If it was a tear down approach, I knew how it was going to tear down and how many years that was going to take. I mean, we were all involved in that. And now from your local association on up, they don't get any information at all. So yeah, I think you're exactly right.
I don't know who's funded unless the church planter tells me, and I don't know what they're receiving. They don't reveal that to the state convention, what they're receiving, who's receiving what. To me, that's just wrong. So we ought to know as Southern Baptists how many churches are being funded. How is that $80 million allocated last year? We don't know anything. So you think about this, those of you who are listening, all we know about the funding for church planting last year is that $80 million was spent. Right. How much of that was spent on houses? We don't know. How much on church planter supplements? How much on grants? Salaries for NAM staff? We don't know any of that. All we have is one big $80 million number. And I just don't think that's sufficient. And when the numbers, by the way, one other little fact. He said that you can't trust the numbers before him. But I'll tell you a number that is a pretty black and white number is the net increase in Baptist churches every year. The net increase in the decade prior to the current regime was over 400 a year. In other words, we were growing over 400 churches per year. Prior to COVID, in this last decade, it had dropped to 180. And now it's well below 150. So what that tells me is we were starting real churches and more of them because our net increase was over double what it has been the last decade. So.
Yeah. And, one of the things he mentioned too, when he was trying to respond on the financial deal, kind of fumbling a little bit on that. And he said something about, we supplement planners. They may get $1,000, $2,000 or more, supplement income. Well, that sounds good. But within a few hours of him making that comment, I got a message from a guy up in New York who said, I know our church is a member in a church, but he said, I know that our Manhattan church planter gets nowhere near what he promised that they're giving to church planters. And that's the problem. See, I mean, especially a place like Manhattan, you'd think they would be supplementing at least $1,000 a month to help up there with whatever. But in some places, a guy's getting $250 or $500 a month. Other places, it sounds like they're getting a $500,000 house plus $2,000, $3,000 a month. And I understand adjusting for cost of living and that kind of thing in different places in the country. I mean, you have to kind of look at that. But the difference between $200, $300, $400, $500 a month and $2,000 or more, especially in an area like Manhattan, it's like, it just show the numbers, open the books and show us the numbers. That's really all we need to do.
Numbers.
Yeah, that's all we need to do.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, Randy, look, I appreciate you being generous with your time and giving us some time to give us some of your perspective about what happened. Didn't end up being a round table today. We're a little bit more of a rectangular table, I guess, but I always enjoy talking to you and getting your perspective on some of these things that happened at the convention. And I just appreciate you joining us. And any closing word you might have as we wrap it up today?
I don't think so, really. I do think that we're entering an era. We should have always been in this era where people have more I think if Southern Baptists are going to move forward and gain health, it's going to start at the local level. That's always the local church, and then the local association, the state convention. We know each other by name, even at the state convention level often. We've been in each other's, towns and churches and all of that. And if Southern Baptists are going to move forward in health, it's going to happen first at the local level. At the national level, we need transparency to keep unity and to keep support at the national level. But one thing I'm seeing an increasing number of churches that say, we want to support the local and the local state convention, but not the national convention.
Yep.
And the reason is we know them and we answer questions and and if they can't get that out of the national entities, they're going to lose support, and they have lost support.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of like Kevin Ezell last year at the convention when the pastor had asked him. The pastor was on the floor of the convention, asked for transparency, asked for the salary structures. He got kind of brushed off by Ezell and the trustee chairman. And then in a West Tennessee pastors meeting, this pastor went and talked to him again, and I can't remember the exact quote. I remember seeing it, but this pastor basically said Ezell said to this pastor and that other group of pastors there that he got only 11%. He got almost everything from 11% of the churches. There we go.
Right.
That he needed for his income, and so keep their money. He didn't care about those little small churches because he could recover, that extra few percentage points. And it's like the audacity of an entity leader to speak to local pastors and not understand that, not get that. But my own personal 2 cents worth on this is that's part of what you get. That's the payment you get for putting people in entity leadership that have not had a history of supporting your cooperative ministry effort.
Right.
And we put a man in at NAM who in his first years has publicly said, I had to figure out what to do because I was unaware of how all this worked. And to start with, he was putting down the cooperative program like bam, bam, bam. And then all of a sudden he's like, I can't quite do that because that pays my salary now, and that's, that's been an ongoing problem. And I hadn't seen that change a lot. And you're right. The transparency is going to make all the difference in the world if we can do that. All right. Going to get you and me started on another tirade. And that's not good. Look, Randy, thanks again for joining us. We're going to sign off for today and look forward to other updates. So folks, if you're joining us today, look for other updates as we come down in the days ahead. All right. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you again, Randy.